rather than having independent presentations by our respondents, I'm going to pass the microphone to them and have them talk a little bit about the context and the origin of Bauhaus objects in their collections as a way to provide yet another layer of complexity from which we can then proceed for discussion. So I'll begin with Susanne. Susanne from the Vitra Museum, who began her professional life as a conservator in Munich and in other, working for other organizations as well throughout Germany until she became fairly recently the director of collections at the Vitra Museum in Rhein, near Basel. And to me, that's quite interesting because one of the things as we're looking at these slides and listening to these stories, something sort of stabbed me in the heart a little bit in Laura's presentation about Anni's textile and, you know, signs of use. The vase of flowers on the piano over years ago when the Fleischmanns lived in Mienke Straße in Charlottenburg. And because I also work in an archive and tend to paintings and weavings and drawings and photographs and very, very fragile pedagogical studies in our own collection, Bauhaus is 100 years old. And these objects, many of them, not designed for everyday use, but designed as prototypes or designed as exercises, really have the delicacy of them and the fragility of them is something that we deal with in our collections. I'll say more about this later. I'll pass this to Susanne.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. The topic of conservation is quite a huge topic, a wide topic. Maybe we find time to address it at later occasions. But I will take the chance to tell you more about a special holding of the Vitra Design Museum's collection. So first of all, the holdings in regard to the Bauhaus, in a direct regard to the Bauhaus at our place, are not very extensive. They're not even extensive. We have a few objects that are directly related, like stool for the famous Bauhaus canteen that was given us directly from a former Bauhäusler, and a few other things, but not that many. But what I would like to focus in this context is an estate we acquired in 1989 for our museum, and it's the estate of Anton Lorenz. You might probably heard about it. Who was Anton Lorenz? He is, we call it the graue Eminenz, the Eminence grise, the gray eminence behind the commercial success of the tubular steel furniture. Why that happened? The holdings consist at least dates, it's mostly documents. Documents, professional and private correspondence, patent issues, licensing documents, dating from 1933 to 1974, and occupying roughly about 45 meters of shelf space, just to give you an imagine of what it is. And Anton Lorenz, a born Hungarian, came to Berlin in 1922 or 23 and set up a workshop as a metal workshop. And we don't know why and when, but he got in contact with Kalman Lengyel and Marcel Breuer, who were searching for someone who could produce Breuer's iconic pieces of furniture. Breuer's steel tube furniture was he actually developed or designed at the Bauhaus together with the Junkers workshop there. And as I said, now he was searching for a place where he could produce or at least manufacture his designs in a more serial way. So Kallmann, Lengyel, and Breuer, they set up this company called Standardmöbel, and Lorenz became managing director. And surely not by coincidence, the metal workshop of Lorenz and Standardmöbel shared the same mailing address. So, and Lorenz is probably one of the first who were really aware of the potential of this new type of furniture. And he started to procure patents and to found businesses, and did that very, very successfully. And he started also to approach other people like Mies van der Rohe, Gropius, Alvar Aalto, Le Corbusier, and many more, to discuss with them issues of licensing. And he made a very clever move when acquiring directly from Mazdam all users' rights. So Lorenz was able to deal with Mazdam designs the way he wanted. And this was a turning point. And as I already mentioned, Lorenz really was keen on monitoring adherence of licensing fees and focused on legal protection of patents, and even if it was necessary, he took legal action. So it was not a very sympathetic, but a really effective, really precise and meticulous way of dealing with the issue of the mass production that was at that time already of tubular steel furniture. And he has really kind of unique position in the service of this industry. And he was probably also the reason why these objects became so popular and were produced in quite a wide range and really in a way of mass production. So
it's interesting because it moves beyond the sort of fetishized, unique object of the Bauhaus and the prototype, which is such a big part of so many of our collections, towards the mass production and the success of the model.
Yeah, and we also, part of the estate are also royalty statements which are showing us the amount of furniture that were sold at the end of the 30s, at the time where the Nazi party was already in charge. So, and we see that, at that time they sold very well. And at least Mies van der Rohe and Lorenz could make a living out of it. So, and the success of this industry were actually stopped by the outbreak of World War II because of material shortage.
The metals, as well as workers in order to manufacture the conversion of industries.
And that brings me to the topic, the provenance question, which we're not facing that many problematic issues with this type of furniture because it was probably also well-known, accepted. So it was not an issue to escape.
So Thilo Grabach, Director of Collections at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum. Do you want to talk a bit about the development and the place of collecting modern design within this important and historic museum?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. The Germanic National Museum was founded in 1851, and there was the paradigm not to collect art and craft after 1800. And this paradigm was held until 1963. So we don't have a grown collection of contemporary art of the 19th and 18th century. The first painting of a 19th century artist was a self-portrait by Lessa Uri, bought in 1964. So we don't had Bauhaus until then.
And then what happened?
Then what happened? Yes, many things. We don't have 31,000 Bauhaus objects. We maybe have 31, but we have an icon which is on display in Berlin at the moment. We have the Tee-Extrakt-Kännchen of Marianne Brandt. It's the object, the most land object in the Germanic National Museum. But this was bought in the 1990s, and the provenance, I cannot say something about that. It was before my time, and I didn't do research on that. But we also have some objects that come from the estate of Ludwig Grote, who was director of the museum, general director until from 1951 to 1962. And even he didn't cut this paradigm not to collect contemporary art. But after he resigned, he sold objects to the museum. So we have 2 Vasily chairs and 2 chairs B30, I think, of the belongings of Ludwig Grote. Then we have a Bauhaus Chess, which was given to the house by my predecessor, sorry, Lutz Schadenbach. And this chest was bought by his father in Dresden in 1926. So we can see it. It was bought, had been bought on an exhibition in Dresden. I couldn't find out more. And also, the Germanic Museum has a whole complex of craft works given to the house by the Bayerisches Gewerbemuseum. That is a special type of museum, maybe not only in Germany, but it's only for crafts, and it's about ornaments, and like a university or high school, you could study how to do exact handwork. And this museum was closed in the 1970s, and in the late 1980s, it was bought by the state of Bavaria and then given to the Germanic National Museum. And so we also have 3 objects that were bought at an exhibition in Nuremberg in 1927, I think, or in 1926, directly from the Bauhaus shop that was there. And I can say that there was a vase by Theodor Bogler. It was bought for 1.2 marks. So I wished they bought more. If you would like to sell it, maybe it's 1,000 more.
More. Today more.
So today more, yes.
Since yesterday or the day before, there's no question that certainly, and it's one of the effects of the centennial celebrations throughout Germany and also in the United States is back in 1961, as Hans Wingler was putting together the archive in Darmstadt, he relied on gifts from the artists, and occasionally things would come up on the secondary art trade, but the creation of a Bauhaus market and private Bauhaus collectors. I think that's the subject of a later session here, so I won't go into it. I have one specific question, and then I want to open it up to more general questions. This is for Mienke. Does Rotterdam own the Citroën collage?
No.
Oh.
No, unfortunately not. It's from the collections of the print room of the University of Leiden.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of 2 things come to mind, and it's maybe more in the form of a comment to kind of direct the conversation, and questions may arise as my mouth works. How much the historiography of the Bauhaus, such as we understand it, and what we know the Bauhaus to be or believe it to be, has been shaped by the exhibitions put on by institutions. Laura mentioned the 1930 exhibition, which had not a very wide influence, but given the connection of MoMA and Harvard, I'm guessing a few people saw that show. The shows that come to mind markedly for me are the 1938 Moma Exhibition with its wide tour, and there were two versions of that show that toured all across the United States, including to small towns and to fledgling modern art museums in places like Springfield, Massachusetts, and San Francisco, California. And then there was a war. And so after the war, the first major exhibition was the 1950 exhibition at the Munich Haus der Kunst, organized by Ludwig Grothe with the financial assistance of the United States Army, who was running the Central Art Collecting Point in Munich. And after the war, the first really significant exhibition is 1961 in Darmstadt, put on by Hans Wengler. And then we have to wait until 1968 in Stuttgart, an exhibition which was supported by the Department of Foreign Affairs in Germany, and which toured widely in Germany and then internationally, versions of that show as well. And then after that, we begin to have the Bauhaus myths and the Bauhaus understanding that many of us certainly grew up with and have held until various points with the reunification of Germany and the revitalization of the program here in Dessau. Some significant turns and twists in the historiography and our understanding. And there's no question that this 100-year celebration and the funding that was made available to museums throughout Germany and elsewhere has influenced our understanding of the Bauhaus in ways that we're just beginning to appreciate. And certainly for me, being able to see the show in Rotterdam was mind-blowing in its own way, and in part because it had this wonderful balance of the objects of art and the documents of pedagogy. And with that, now I have a question for you about if you could talk a bit about the sources of some of those documents, because your exhibition presented not just the fine art, but actually presented this as a history of education and the conversation between the various institutes of education and the inheritance of people like some of the students who returned to the Netherlands to open their own schools for a time. Would you talk a little bit more about your thinking and your research and also the sources of some of those documents and artifacts that you brought?
Yeah. Yes, to start with the schools, the art schools were indeed, I think, 5 of the 23 knotenpunkten in our exhibition, and were, of course, really very important because, to my opinion, schools were the most important part where influencing took place. That's without any doubt. Well, of course, for us organizing in the Netherlands an exhibition on the Bauhaus was rather difficult in this Bauhaus year because we couldn't get any loans from the important German institutions. So I had to do my very, very best to find new things. And, well, in the end, the disadvantage became an advantage because I could find, I think, really interesting new stuff just by looking, doing much, much more research. And, well, it was like a snowball project, and starting with in the end, coming to the former students and their relatives and their sons and daughters, and going to them, asking them, and well, then eventually I found pretty much, and even till a couple of months and sometimes weeks before the opening of the exhibition, more works popped up. And very interesting was indeed a lot of works from this Nieuwe Kunstschool, New Art School of Paul Citroen. I found by the daughter of, oh boy, one of the students, two students who got married, and she just had in her attic piles of works done by those students. But also important, very coincidence of unexpected was to find works by from the legacy of Gerda Marx, for instance, a female student in Dessau. Her son, who appears to be living almost 100 meters from the museum, strangely enough, who had also in his attic works from his mother, some works that were even printed in the Moma catalog of '38, and it was just in a shoebox in the attic, and so. Well, a lot popped up, actually. But the student work was, for me, very interesting. And that's something, as a museum, you don't collect. Well, we don't collect, because we are not an archive. We are actually, in the first place, we are an art museum. So, well, student work is not... No, it's not on the forefront. But on the opposite of our museum is the Nieuwe Institute. Hetty Berends is in the room here, my colleague over there. And they collect a lot of student work. For instance, the works of the students by Johan Niggemann. Johan Niggemann, who was... working together with Gropius for a couple of years and was a teacher at the Dessau Bauhaus as well, where he met Gerda Marx and they got married. And Niggemann became a teacher at what's now called the Rietveld Academy. And what the studies he let his students make were, well, in all aspects, Bauhaus projects.
Do you have questions? Yeah. Oh. Laura, do you have a question? I have a question for you. Are Harvard University Art Museums continuing to collect Bauhaus material? And if so, what have been your strategies or what have been your opportunities? Both for funding, but also for gifts.
Definitely. I don't know, this is on, okay. The museum isn't super actively still collecting Bauhaus material because there are other priorities the institution covers, from medieval period to contemporary, and with such a strong Bauhaus collection, it's not the top priority. But I think the curator, Lynette Roth, is interested in thinking a little bit about expanding the narrative beyond the kind of Gropius-centered narrative. So, for example, we recently acquired a work by a student who had studied with Itten in the years after the Bauhaus had closed, just to kind of illustrate the continuity of Bauhaus pedagogy in Germany. We have a lot of material illustrating the continuity of Bauhaus pedagogy in the United States, but it's not balanced out with other material like that. And it's an artist whose name escapes me, but isn't highly in demand. So it's material that is accessible. But the prices for Bauhaus material really kind of do make it beyond our reach. We acquired our first Moholy-Nagy photogram in 2004 or 5, and that was a major acquisition. Expensive object to acquire, but it seemed to be an important, to fill out the collection. Historically, photography just didn't really have a status where it was a collecting object for the institution. Charles Kuhn would have original vintage works of art photographed and then return the vintage photographs to Moholy-Nagy and others, and just retain the photographs, because it was always kind of conceived of as a study collection, archive meant to be used by students and faculty. So sometimes that kind of original versus facsimile question was, you know, having the original wasn't so important.
Shall we? Questions in the audience? Comments from the audience?
I have a question for Laura Muir, because our museum is connected with a university too. So I'm curious about the collection, the Bauhaus collection in Beuningen Museum. How were those collections used by the students, teachers, and how frequently used by them? What's the influence on their study or teaching? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Zoe. It's a really good question, and I haven't found a lot of documentation for actually how the collection was used by faculty or students. I know that Charles Kuhn, the curator, you know, exhibited the collection a lot. It was on view. It was accessible through the study room, so people were able to come and view it. He also, as part of this kind of famous museum training course at Harvard, there were a number of exhibitions that were organized by students in this museum training course on Bauhaus topics. So that was one way of using the collection as part of sort of learning curatorial practice. But I haven't come across actually Professor so-and-so having a seminar on Kandinsky and using material from the collection, but that was always part of the kind of the early ambition, and very, very much it was not just collecting the kind of fine art objects or only design objects, but really making sure that the you know, teaching materials, the student exercises were part of collecting. So that was always important to represent that aspect of the Bauhaus.
I'll make a quick comment here, because the Albers Foundation does use our pedagogical material as part of education programs, both education programs which are focused on them as historical objects, but also as living pedagogical models from which we've developed our own versions of preliminary course activities, but also working from Black Mountain College student notes and from photographs and our own knowledge, and actually talking sometimes with very elderly people who themselves were students at Black Mountain to be able to resurrect that. And so we have color classes, paper folding, structural studies. A couple of years ago here in Dessau, we did a week-long version of the preliminary course for the Bauhaus Agenten, who would be affiliated with the 3 museums, and then have subsequently done versions of those workshops elsewhere and all around the world. So it is a living pedagogy rather than just a museological object, I believe. Question?
Yeah, also for Laura, I was interested in that one page of recommendations by Gropius. What year was that?
1948.
1948. Is that the only page of that document?
No, it's just the first page.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know it's probably impossible for me to ask this, but whether or not Johannes Itten was on the list, as well as Bruno Adler, or anyone from the Weimar time.
It was kind of a selective list, and I'm pretty sure that neither Adler nor Itten were on the list. You know, there's Hannes Meyer is not on the list. There are sort of that, and that list was for Bauhaus members currently in the United States.
Oh.
And then there was a subsequent list that Gropius provided of Bauhaus members still in Europe. That was like a couple of months later.
He corresponded with both those men, both before and after the war. And,
Gropius did?
yep.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question to Laura Muir from the Boijmans. We have in our archive letters written by Hannes Meyer and his wife, Lena Meyer-Bergner, to a woman then living in the USA in the late 40s, early 50s are these letters written. And this woman was a former member of the staff of Hannes Meyer in his team in Mexico. And then he was back in the late 40s in his home, Switzerland. And in these letters, they are talking about letters that came from Charles Kuhn, from the Busch Reisinger. And he was asking Hannes Meyer and Lena Meyer-Berger for works. And he had the plan to make his collection of Bauhaus more complete, also including Hannes Meyer and Lena Meyer-Bergner. Was it successful? Do you have works of Hannes Meyer and Lena Meyer-Bergner?
We have a few things that came from Hannes Meyer as part of kind of a separate initiative, not coming directly through Gropius's recommendation. I think that was a separate thing that Kuhn did connect with Hannes Meyer, and there's kind of a handful of more documentary materials, some publications. The issue of Red magazine is in our collection from Hannes Meyer, but it's this intriguing thing because some of those things were also categorized at some point as bibliography along with a lot of other materials in our collection, and they were transferred to the library, and in some cases we don't know what happened to that, but definitely Hannes Meyer did send some things to the Busch Reisinger Museum. He sent, a portrait of himself. So I think there was a sense that he too wanted to be represented in this Bauhaus archive in the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have anything from Lena Bergner from that time. We have a gouache study for one of her textiles that came in, I think, in the 1990s. And more recently, we received a gift from a supporter of some kind of technical weaving drawings that she did in Mexico City. But the collection is very strongly weighted to the Gropius years. And luckily, actually, we have a PhD student at Harvard who will be writing her dissertation on Hannes Meyer and Lena Bergner.
So much of the ephemera, which might be considered secondary material now, seems very primary to me. Magazines, photographs, newspaper clippings, things like that. Because if it made its way to the United States and made its way into a museum, it means it still exists at a time during the 30s and 40s when a lot of ephemera and publications lost their way or were destroyed, particularly from smaller newspapers where there was no existing archive to hold them.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I have a question for Susanne. The collection of papers that you told about really sparked my interest because the business of design is often not very well represented in, especially in exhibitions where we tend to focus on other things. I was at a business history conference recently, and interestingly, design came up there, and it was an archivist of a company that manufactures tubular steel furniture in India, and they are beginning to look at how patents and rights for designs worked in their context. And I thought it was really interesting, and I was wondering, how does the Vitra Museum sort of talk about this side of this very important aspect of design, commercialization, and all these sensitive things. Does it, are any exhibitions that you make informed by this, or will be?
Thank you for this question. I mean, I just talked about the Lorenz estate, and we as the Vitra Design Museum, we are more approaching this aspect from a kind of historical side. There is Vitra as a commercial furniture brand on the other hand with its own archive, so that might be a different story. But we're looking at all these questions more from a very historic, not very historic, but from a historic, let's say, museum perspective. But we found it also very, very interesting that this business correspondence can tell you so much more information, can give you so much more information on kind of topics which we might think we know, at least the most of it. So, and as with the Lorenz estate, it's really an interesting story, but as Jeannette, you said that it's former times it was Bauhaus objects were kind of this unique and this myth of this unique piece. But no, it was a very commercial history as well. And it was a very successful history, and it had a starting point at the Bauhaus with Marcel Breuer and his designs. But then it became a story of its own. And even Mats Dam or Mies van der Rohe, when they designed their cantilever chairs, I'm actually not sure if they were aware of what's going on at the Bauhaus. Lorenz wasn't at all. He was not interested in the Bauhaus. He was really interested in the commercial success of this type of furniture. So I think it's for us it's a chance to tell kind of a different story, but it's also a challenge because these stories are often very complex. And we will have to find a way to tell these stories in a way that also our visitors are interested in to listen to.
After today, talking with you and seeing your presentation, I am so ready to see an exhibition about international design and production of tubular furniture, including perhaps even up to the contemporary day. I mean, the techniques of it and the ingenuity of it just seems really fascinating.
I mean, really, we have on our holdings, we have sales brochures from Japan, probably also India. I have to check, I have to say, because Lorenz really was aware what was going on worldwide. Not just in Germany or Switzerland, he was really following this issue all over the world.
I think that concludes our presentation this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, panelists.